Welcome to video number 6, working with paths and shapes, level 1, part 2. So we've kind of got our fundamentals here, and as I mentioned briefly before, we've got our layers palette. So when I'm working with Adobe Illustrator, once I start to get a few number of things on my artboard, whatever it might be, let's start to work with an actual real graphic instead of just a bunch of random things. Let's say I want to start building this thing out, and I'm trying to make a cog, let's say, out of this. So this is my layer, and then this is my path. And one thing you'll notice when you're building up shapes in Adobe Illustrator, most of the time, if you're using a pen tool or whatever, it's just going to call it a path. So it's a closed path on a layer. So you can make your layers whatever you want. But then you're going to kind of notice that there's like a structure to them. You can collapse paths, but a simple path is just the beginning, right? And let's say I wanted to make this sort of like a shape within a shape. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key and I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to hold down Alt and Shift to scale it down so that it kind of gets small there. And then I'm going to put it back inside there. And because I've got smart guides on, it can kind of help me where I've intersected it. So I've got these two shapes, but what I want is I just want to be able to fill this one interior shape. And let's just say I'm going to rotate it a little, whatever. So right now these are just two independent paths. So if I click and drag with my selection tool over both of them, it's going to grab both of them. So let's just pay attention to what's happening in the layer palette when I do that. Okay, got that shape there, which I can hide. And that shape there, which I can hide. When I click that, it deselects them. I can also select shapes here. I can also hold down the Shift key to select both of them at the same time, so that when I click on a path to move it around, they both behave together. I rotate them, they both rotate together. They're working as if they're a group, but they are not yet grouped. I have to hold down Shift to do that because they're still independent shapes. So I can group them together, and now that's called a group. Now every time I click on that group, now it selects them both. I can still treat those two shapes independently because those two paths I have are still part of that group. Okay, so if I want to go in and multiply that group, I can double click on this shape. This enters with something that's called isolation mode. So I'm going to draw your attention to the upper left-hand corner here. I call this the breadcrumb, but it's sort of like a navigation layer. And you can navigate through your structure here as well. This isn't really doing anything different than what you're doing here. It just means that within my group, I can now make a change to this. Like say I want to fill this with my red, and I want to fill this with my Pantone blue, or I want to change the rotation or the scale or whatever. They're still independent shapes. They don't necessarily, they're not necessarily two shapes that work together, right? So that's how a group works. And if I want to go leave that isolation mode, I'm done with it, I can click here or I can click here, it doesn't really matter, but I can go back up. So isolation mode, you can isolate just a layer or a group or whatever, or you can just go right up to your main level here, which is just working right at your base level in your layer. So there's your first group. Now there's another type of what is often sort of confused. It's not easily confused, but groups are a little different than what are called compound paths. So I'm going to just make I'm going to duplicate this group. So now you can see it duplicated there. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two shapes. I'm going to create what's called a compound path. So I'm going to go Object, Compound Path, Make. So what that's done is that's intersected this interior shape within a compound path. So now you can see it's changed what it is. It's now not divisible, right? It is now treating it as if this is one shape. So the fill, whatever the fill is and whatever the stroke is or pattern that I apply, now are constrained within that compound path. So it's different than a group where those two elements are independent. I want them to work together, but I don't want them to have the same fill and stroke attributes. But a compound path, I want one unified appearance. So you're gonna often be making compound paths out of shapes, and there's quite a few different ways that you can make compound paths. out of those two things. So just getting comfortable with what the difference is between a group and a compound path. As we start to get into more advanced things like custom lettering or what have you, you're going to really want to get comfortable with that. You can always release those compound paths. It's not like the independent shapes disappeared. It's just the way Illustrator treats them in terms of their appearance is still there. So you can right click on a compound path and you can release it, okay? Or you can do object expand, or you can release the compound path. There's different things, like you can go compound path release. So that's a different thing that you can do. As well, you can double click into a compound path just like you can a group, and you can move independently the two shapes. So you can kind of create sort of an interesting, it's just about how these shapes intersect, right? So that's kind of a interesting thing you can do as well. But that's not common, but yeah, if you want to do that, you can. And then you can also edit with the direct selection tool. You can edit even individual anchors within the compound path, and it's just about the intersection of those shapes, and it's going to share that filled attribute. So there's all kinds of unique shapes and things that we can do when we're making compound paths like that. So these two shapes, they do retain their independence. They just the fill is treated differently. So getting comfortable with those two things is a key thing in kind of building out your shapes. So that's kind of the best way I can simplify and define, what the difference is between a group and a compound path. There's another way to create compound paths as well from using a palette called the Pathfinder. Now, I like to group my Pathfinder with my alignment tool and my swatches and my symbols and my attributes, because that sort of fits most of my kind of day-to-day production needs and working with Adobe Illustrator. But you can separate out the Pathfinder palette, because it just looks like this. And if you don't have it available, Window Pathfinder, okay? Shift Control F9 is a shortcut for it. I'm always kind of interested to see that it seems like Adobe kind of guesses what palettes are more important by giving them shortcuts. But anyways, I can't remember those myself so often. If you can't find it, just go to Windows. But that's what we're looking at here is the Pathfinder. So the Pathfinder is kind of a more advanced compound path builder. It's also fairly similar to something over here called the Shape Builder tool. It basically does the same thing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly demo through a pretty typical way to use the Pathfinder. Okay, so let's say we've got a fairly complex star shape. It's got like 40 points, and so it's pretty complex. Got all these little nodes and things, and then we want to intersect a banner that goes across that. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle through it. But I want this red shape, but let's go to outline mode, see how they intersect. I want all of these sections to be red. I want it to keep the perfect star shape, but I want just this banner to run right across the middle. I don't need to go through and manually draw those all out. What I can do is I can just use what's called the divide tool. Okay, so if I hit the divide tool, let's just pay attention in the layer palette over here, what's going on. We got a rectangle and a path, but I hit this Pathfinder tool with both of them selected together. It's gone and created a group, but let's look at what that group has. It's got this shape and this shape. It's intersected those. It's also got this little shape here and this one, and then it's made this shape there. So that was what I wanted. I just wanted a red shape that now perfectly retained the star shape. I don't want a stroke around it, so I'm just going to go take that away. So that's how you can create perfect matches of intersecting shapes, and this can be very useful in countless ways. The divide tool is absolutely precious in terms of custom shape building and breaking out your colors. So you know, again, we're working towards simplifying stuff so that we don't have a ton of stuff overlapping. I mean, as we're gonna, like, in the actual courses, I'll be going through like what the difference is between a kind of a okay Illustrator graphic and a great Illustrator graphic. And really what it comes down to is the way that the shapes are built and how they intersect and how workable they are afterwards, right? So, you know, this group now has kind of gotten quite a bit more complex. There's all these little bits. You've got this red shape, and then I see I've got two more little red shapes, these little tags here that it created that are little tiny things that I didn't notice because I wasn't zoomed in. You know, but realistically, I want to get rid of those. I want these little points to be perfect. So that's where zooming in close is kind of important in Adobe Illustrator a lot of the time. And you know, I'm probably zoomed in too close, but you know, I'm constantly using the drag tool to navigate around my shape while I'm zoomed in. So delete those little things, and then let's just zoom out a little, Control minus. So we got that. So these are all things now that, you know, I've created all these separate paths, but really I want those all unified. I've got my one red shape, that's great. But now I want all these to behave like one thing with a common fill. So again, this is where I'm going to use my compound path combined with that to kind of get this more complex shape going. So I'm just going to grab one, and I could hold down Shift and go and select every one, but this is select same fill color. Very quick, it's a shortcut to select multiple shapes. You know, holding down the Shift key to multi-select wouldn't be too bad. But then I'm going to want to turn that into a compound path within the group. So I've got this one path, which is just red, and then all these blue bits, which I want to unify. So compound path make. We're going to be doing this a lot in Adobe Illustrator, so you're going to learn the shortcut, which is Control-8 or Command-8 on the Mac. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be doing. So just to because I select same, I mean, I could do same appearance. They're all going to do the same thing. Control-8. That's made a compound path out of this shape. Another thing that you can start doing is you could start naming things. You don't have to stick with these default names. If you double click on this group, we can call this Starburst, let's say. And then I might call this Red Banner. And then Blue Star. So you can rename those things, right? I mean, Illustrator is not going to forget that it's a compound path just because you renamed it. It allows you to rename that whatever you want. The only challenge there is that sometimes it's not always obvious. If you're not used to it, if you're not used to working with a compound path, it's not obvious that this isn't a group. It's only going to become obvious once you know what you're looking at when you do something like, okay, I just want to change the color. And you know, you start to just get comfortable with saying, well, that's how compound paths behave. I didn't have to click all of them to get them to be the same color, or I could just apply a single gradient to them all. You know, that's how compound paths behave, which is different than groups. But if you're still kind of relying on the layer to help you know what type of shape you're dealing with, then that's fine. Don't rename things. But this just starts to organize your graphics in a way that makes them workable. So the Pathfinder has quite a few interesting shape modes. I'm just going to kind of go through really quickly some of the typical ways that I use them. They have a myriad of applications, but a really common one is you sort of got, you know, sort of a nifty shape, and then you drew another nifty shape. I think the niftiness of those shapes is pretty subjective, but you know, you're like, oh, I actually want the intersection of these right there to be a different color, so that's where the divide tool is. Or you might say, well, you know what, I actually just want to make this into one big shape. I actually like the overall shape of this, but I don't want to have to redo it. So that's what the Unite tool is all about. I use the Unite tool really, really commonly. Another thing is that you might also say, you know, oh, I'd really like to cut out a perfect square out of this. I don't know why I'd want to do that, because this nifty shape is getting uglier as I go. But, you know, I could say, well, I just want this perfect square. So that's what the divide minus front is. It's kind of like a cookie cutter, kind of like punching a shape out of that, right? So you can really start to build, you're more just kind of cleaning stuff up, and it'll definitely come to bear when you're working on specific things, when you're trying to achieve real specific things like custom lettering or whatever, your Pathfinder tool becomes really, really useful. You know, converting outline minus back, cropping, yeah, they all behave a little differently. Merging is pretty much the same. It's just a little different than divide. What I would basically say is just don't forget the Pathfinder tool is here. And as you're working on graphics, as you do things, really think about how you could use these different tools to achieve your kind of final clean shape. But the whole goal is to just, we really don't want to be relying too much on stacking a whole bunch of shapes over top of each other to achieve our look. We actually want to be able to kind of have a continuous shape. That's sort of our ultimate sort of goal when we're working with custom shapes. You know, I'm just going to go a little bit into this one, the Shape Builder tool, because it kind of is like you'll see here. I'm just going to make a mishmash of primitives here. Right? So say we just want to unite all that into one shape. You know, the Pathfinder Unite would do it, but then so would the Shape Builder. So I can select all these and then grab the Shape Builder tool, and then it's going to kind of highlight all the colors. So I can just kind of drag through it. And it's essentially done what the Unite tool does, but it's much sloppier. I find it much easier to just use the Unite tool. I don't really, it doesn't offer any differences, you know. And there's some kind of weird things that are underneath there. Live paint bucket, live paint selection tool. All of this is achievable with the appearance palette. Although you sometimes just want to select just an area of color intersection or whatever, but pretty rare. But yeah, there's some of these tools. The Shape Builder tool, it's just a different way of achieving exactly what the Pathfinder shape mode does. So I don't know, semi-useless little sub-tool in the palette here. I mean, a lot of these really are. Scaling, I mean, there's a place for them. Rotating, but these are all built into the default handles. So once you get comfortable with how these work, you're going to find that you're just never going to touch these because there's no point to them. They're just extra ways to do what's going on here. There is, however, a pretty handy couple of tools here when we're working with our shapes that allow us to do some pretty cool things that you can't really do any other way. So let's say I wanted to, well, let's do something a little more basic. I'm gonna blend. I want to go from a square shape. I want a square end to a round end. You know, I could do that in various ways, kind of mess around with the shapes, but a lot of times what we want to do is we want to kind of create these interesting sort of transitions of, maybe a big dot to a small dot, or a square dot to a round dot. So this is what the Blender tool is all about. So it's kind of an extension of shape building, and it gets into applying effects and filters, and this is the next sort of step in working with paths, and that's what I'm going to move on to in video number 7, because this video is creeping up on my 20-minute time limit. So I'm gonna move on to more advanced kind of shape building and blending in video 7.